There is a quiet humiliation in being treated the way you secretly believe you deserve. Not in big, dramatic betrayals, in the smaller things. The way people interrupt you and you let it happen. The way they ask too much and you say yes anyway. The way they speak to you with a tone they would never use with someone who is fully rooted in themselves. And what hurts most is not only that they do it, it is that some part of you has been cooperating. You may not say that out loud. You may call it patience, kindness, maturity, understanding. But deep down, you know the feeling. You know what it is like to leave a conversation and feel slightly diminished, to agree to something you did not want, to stay soft on the outside while something inside you goes cold. That is not peace. That is self-betrayal happening in real time. Many people think self-respect is confidence, a strong voice, firm eye contact, better boundaries, more self-esteem. But real self-respect begins much earlier than that. It begins in the moment you stop treating your own inner truth as negotiable. That is where most people get lost, not because they are weak, because they adapted. Somewhere along the way, they learned that being fully themselves came with a cost. Maybe honesty created tension. Maybe anger made people withdraw. Maybe sadness was too inconvenient. Maybe need was met with irritation. Maybe love only felt available when you were easy, helpful, calm, pleasing, useful. So you learned. You learned how to keep the peace, how to smooth the moment, how to sense what others needed before they had to ask, how to abandon yourself so gracefully it looked like goodness. At the time, that adaptation may have saved you. That is why this wound is so hard to recognize, because the traits that now make you disappear were once intelligent forms of survival. You became agreeable because conflict felt dangerous. You became selfless because having needs felt shameful. You became emotionally responsible for everyone because no one seemed responsible for you. And after enough years, you stopped noticing the cost. You stopped noticing how often you swallowed what you really felt, how quickly you explained yourself, how automatically you made room for other people while shrinking your own reality. This is how identity loss happens. Not all at once, quietly. You become so practiced at adjusting to others that you no longer know where you end and they begin. You know how to read a room, but not yourself. You know how to keep a relationship stable, but not how to stay real inside it. You know how to be accepted, but not how to feel present. And then one day, you realize something painful. The reason people keep crossing your boundaries is not only that they lack awareness. It is that you have been teaching them how far they are allowed to go. Not with words, with repetition. Every time you laugh off what hurt, every time you say yes while your body says no, every time you override your discomfort to remain likable, every time you stay in a dynamic that costs you your selfhood, you are sending a message. My limits are flexible. My truth can wait. My needs are optional. My inner life is less important than your comfort. People feel that, even when you never say it. This is why the lack of respect becomes so painful, because it is not only coming from the outside, it is echoing something you have been doing inwardly for years. Carl Jung understood that what we repeatedly reject in ourselves does not disappear. It sinks below the surface. And from there, it shapes us. If your anger was judged, you may have buried it. If your directness threatened connection, you may have softened it into hesitation. If your dignity once risked abandonment, you may have learned to confuse self-erasure with love. This is how the false self forms. Not from vanity. You become the version of yourself that preserves attachment, even if it destroys your center. You become acceptable, pleasant, easy to be around. But inwardly, something starts to rot. Because the self cannot be denied forever without consequence. Sooner or later, the cost appears. Sometimes as resentment, sometimes as numbness, sometimes as exhaustion so deep rest does not touch it, sometimes as the strange ache of being surrounded by people and still feeling profoundly unseen, and sometimes as this realization: I do not even respect myself when it matters most. I respect myself in theory, in private, in the abstract, but not in the live moment when it costs something. Not when someone is disappointed, not when the room changes temperature, not when saying the truth might make me less lovable. That is the test. Self-respect is not what you believe about yourself on your best day. It is what you refuse to abandon when closeness is at risk. That is why so many people feel empty, because they have built lives around being good to others while being subtly disloyal to themselves. They call it love, but love without self-respect becomes self-loss. You start giving things that were never yours to give away: your time, your energy, your attention, your body's signals, your emotional truth. And then you wonder why people do not value you. But value is shaped by what you protect. If you treat your own inner world as cheap, others will follow your lead. Not always consciously, but they will feel it. They will feel where you fold, where you apologize for existing, where you abandon your own side in order to stay connected. And that is why respect has so much to do with identity. Because every act of self-respect is also an act of self-recognition. It says, this feeling matters, this boundary matters, this hurt counts, this no is real. This yes must be honest. This life is not available for quiet self-betrayal anymore. At first, this can feel cruel, especially if your identity was built around being understanding. You may feel guilty for becoming less available. You may feel selfish for becoming harder to use. You may feel cold for not over-explaining. But that guilt is not always a sign that you are wrong. Sometimes it is just the old conditioning protesting the end of your disappearance. Because the moment you stop abandoning yourself, some relationships change. Some people were not attached to your essence. They were attached to your compliance, to your emotional labor, to your flexibility, to your willingness to absorb what should never have been yours. So when you begin to respect yourself, not everyone will like the person who returns. That is painful, but it is clarifying. It shows you who was meeting you and who was merely benefiting from your lack of boundaries. This is where healing becomes real, not in becoming harder, in becoming more honest, more loyal to your own experience, more willing to disappoint others than to keep wounding yourself. That does not mean aggression. It does not mean arrogance. Real self-respect is quiet. It does not need to perform strength. It simply stops negotiating with what is true. It notices the tightening in your chest before you say yes. It hears the inner no before politeness covers it. It lets anger become information instead of shame. It lets sadness exist without rushing to minimize it. It stops asking, how do I stay liked? And starts asking, what would it mean to stay with myself here? That question changes a life, Because once you begin answering it honestly, something starts to return. Your voice sounds different. Your body feels less like an enemy. Your relationships become more revealing. Your loneliness becomes cleaner. And little by little, the stranger inside you begins to feel familiar again. This is the deeper meaning. Until you respect yourself, nobody else will. Not because the world is always cruel, but because people take their cues from what you repeatedly permit, from what you protect, from what you betray, from what you silently agree to. And once you stop agreeing to your own diminishment, everything changes. Not all at once, but in quiet, irreversible ways. A boundary lands without apology. A truth is spoken without panic. A dynamic that once drained you no longer gets access. A version of you that was buried under years of pleasing finally begins to stand up. That is not ego. That is recovery. Because the real tragedy was never that others failed to honor you. It was that you kept leaving before anyone else had the chance. And the real turning point is not making people respect you. It is no longer participating in your own erasure. Once that changes, something becomes unmistakable. You stop begging to be valued in places that require your self-betrayal. You stop confusing accommodation with love. You stop shrinking to remain acceptable. And in that refusal, a different kind of life begins. Not louder, not harder, just more real. And from that place, respect is no longer something you chase from other people. It becomes something they either meet in you or lose access to.